Thank you. Pardon me. Thank you, Sonia. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this joint panel on AI ethics and qualitative research. As Sonia said, my name is Jillian Lemmermeyer. I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Nursing and the associate director for the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology. We say IIQM for short, at the University of Alberta in Canada. I will be moderating the session today, as Sonia said, and would really like to thank the WCQR for partnering with the IIQM for our Ways of Knowing series to showcase some remarkable University of Alberta scholars during this pre-conference session. Thank you, especially to Sonia and Fabio for helping us all along the way. I will introduce my colleagues in just a moment, but first I'd like to start with a relational engagement. In Canada, the 30th of September is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. We also call it Orange Shirt Day. You can see that we're all wearing orange shirts. It is a day of remembrance to recognize the tragic and ongoing intergenerational effects of the Canadian Indian residential school system. The University of Alberta is actually closed today to honor the children who didn't come home from these schools and to reflect on the continued effects of the residential schools. And I'm just going to place a link in the chat if anyone would like to learn more about that. Oh. Just one sec here. Oh, I don't know if I can do that, Sonia. Can I? Oh, yeah, I can to everyone. Okay. There you go. So for our part, we go into this session bearing the meaningfulness of this day and the opportunity to share with you an international audience the importance of not only remembering what happened, but of taking action to address the causes of historical trauma and broken covenants with Indigenous peoples. If you'd like to take a second, I see many people already are putting where they're from in the chat. Please continue to do that. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our panel members, all from the University of Alberta. Dr. Vern Glaser is a professor in the Department of Strategy, Entrepreneurship, and Management at the Alberta School of Business. He also serves as the academic director of the Alberta Business Family Institute. Vern's research explores how organizations use AI and data analytics to transform decision-making and spark innovation, insights he weaves into the classroom with real-world case studies and interactive discussions. Dr. Ali Shiri is a professor in the School of Library and Information Studies in the Faculty of Education and the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Graduate and Postdoctoral Studies. Ali has been teaching, researching, and writing about digital information interaction and retrieval, Inuvialuit, cultural heritage digital libraries, data and learning analytics, and more recently, generative AI in research and higher education. Dr. Michael Van Manen is the chair in health ethics, the director of the John Dossiter Health Ethics Center, and an associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Alberta here. He also has a clinical practice as a physician in neonatal perinatal medicine with the Stollery Children's Hospital. His research projects relate to ethical decision-making, the experiential life of the fetus newborn, the use of medical technologies in clinical encounters, and patient-family experiences of hospital care. For the most part, when we talk about AI today, we mean large language models, or LLMs, at least in this context. Our interests in this topic take at least two paths. One is considering the ethics of AI as qualitative research method, and the other is recognizing that qualitative methods are uniquely positioned to explore the ethics of AI technologies as they're used in different settings in all kinds of worlds. So let's begin with you, Vern, and let me ask, how are you deploying qualitative research to study the ethics and values that are embedded in and shaped by AI or LLMs?
Yeah, thanks, Jillian. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about this important topic. It was interesting. I did my PhD, finished my PhD in 2014, and at the time I was actually studying AI before it became trendy. So I've been studying kind of how organizations use algorithms and analytics for a long time in this process. And and in many ways, what I've been doing with my research agenda, and a lot of people are doing as well, is really trying to understand how organizations are using these tools through qualitative research methods, particularly ethnography, in terms of this process, and seeing, when you go into the ground, into organizations, how are people actually using these tools? The framework that I've come to be able to understand this is really using the concept of an assemblage. One of the kind of the meta reflections I have in looking at the public discourse around AI is people tend to view AI as it's almost like a magic talisman, where AI is good, AI is evil, AI does this. But in many ways, I think what our empirical research has shown is that it's much more complex, and so the way that the theoretical approach that I use to understand it, and that I think really helps explain how AI is used in the wild, is an assemblage approach, where we look at how these technologies are basically combinations of data, of theory, of practices. There's really nested assemblages. If you look at generative AI technologies, you have a large language model that companies like OpenAI with ChatGPT or Google with Gemini have, but those large language models get embedded in AI agents, like a chatbot interface, or there's lots of other different types of AI agents that are used. And those AI agents then get embedded in organizational routines. And so the idea, for me and my research, is basically you have to look at how these different assemblages work together, and there's lots of variation in how they work. So if we look, at how AI is being used in the qualitative research process, there's lots of different ways that these assemblages can be configured in order for qualitative researchers to do this. There's an assemblage for doing literature reviews. There would be a different way you could use it for doing data coding. And so, I think understanding that, the kind of the technical ways that these assemblages are used in different ways is very important to understand the phenomenon.
Yeah, and I think we'll get back. We'll talk more about these assemblages as we go. But Ali or Michael, would you like to respond to Vern, or answer the question yourself? How are you deploying qualitative research to study ethics and values embedded in shaped by LLMs?
Michael, you want to go ahead?
Sure.
Um, thanks, Gillian. And just building on what Vern said, I take a kind of a more not personal, but also from the perspective of graduate research and postdoctoral research, and how we ensure that there is elements of innovation, but also accountability and integrity. And what I mean by that is um, developing guardrails and guidelines around how we would use large language models, and there is a variety of them, and even understanding them, or their implications in the research process. As Vern said, really, when you think about the research process from the inception of an idea or brainstorming to knowledge mobilization at the other end of the spectrum, there's a huge range of activities and research activities, qualitative, quantitative, and textual activities that could benefit from, but also would require proper attention and human oversight in terms of what tools should be used for what purposes. And then there is, the CEO of OpenAI mentioned this year is going to be the year of agents, basically tools that can do different things for different purposes. So it's not just those large foundation models like the ones that Vern mentioned, like OpenAI or Google or Meta AI or Mistral, but instantiations and instances of those products. So there is a kind of a generation of research tools called AI research assistants. And this could be for conducting large-scale meta-analysis to assisting with the research process, or finding articles based on citation or bibliometric analysis. So, and then implications around how some tools can be used for analyzing qualitative data, whether it's coding, thematic analysis, or more deeper dive into the meaning or post-structuralist approaches to content analysis. And these platforms are really are really evolving really fast, even in terms of the degree of hallucination or fabrication that we noticed even in GPT-3 that wasn't even public to GPT 3.5 to date. So what are the implications for research, graduate research and postdoctoral research and research in general? And how do we educate this new generation of researchers in terms of responsible, ethical, and appropriate use of generative AI, recognizing the challenges and ethical issues that surround these platforms. So really trying to ensure that guardrails, but also providing AI literacy education. So I've been working with a team on campus to develop a number of AI literacy educational opportunities, our U of A libraries, for example, Center for Teaching and Learning. And this task is really kind of overarching because you really need to involve, and this is quite interdisciplinary, involve a number of different units and partners to be able to achieve this. This is not one single thing, and this is not just a technical issue, it's the ethical, cultural, sociological impact that these platforms have.
Thanks, Ellie. So these are pretty broad perspectives. What do you have to say, Michael?
Thank you again, Jillian. Sorry, I have a bit of a cold today. So I'm using what did you say it? My panel voice, my
Podcast
podcasting
voice,
voice.
I think, Sonia. Yeah.
So, my research program is largely centered on exploring human phenomena in healthcare contexts, phenomena related to receiving critical care, living with medical complexity, decision-making, bereavement, and loss. This work has taught me that technologies are constitutive of experiences in often subtle, tacit, yet significant ways. In other words, research centered on human experience cannot ignore the mediational meaning of technologies. So in comparison, I know as qualitative researchers, we cannot simply ignore contemporary technologies like artificial intelligence, particularly as they're used in healthcare contexts, social contexts, pedagogical contexts, and other places. We do well to attend to them, whether they're the topic of our work or they affect our methodologies and methods. I've been interested in large language models to understand how we relate experience to language and language to experience methodologically. That said, I'm quite circumspect regarding their import to qualitative methods, particularly when it comes to drawing near experiences that help us understand our values or approaching the worlds of others, which relates to ethics. So I was a little surprised to be on this panel, but I'm very thankful to be involved in the conversation.
Well, I think we're all glad everyone's here. And, I also align with feeling perhaps more worried about AI and LLMs being used to as methods of qualitative research. And, our next question, unless I might ask Vern or Ali if you'd like to respond to what Michael said. I know, Vern, you have some examples of how different assemblages can perhaps shape these values or at least keep us aware of different values. Is there anything more that you'd like to say about that?
Well, it might be helpful to just give some tangible examples of how
Yes.
this might be used in the qualitative research process. Because I think, there is a very, even within my own department at the university, we have a wide variety of opinions about how these tools might be used in the graduate research process, to speak to what Ali was talking about a little bit earlier. But let's say, for example, we look at the concept of doing a literature review. How do we do a literature review with this? And I think one way to think about doing a literature review is you would ask a question. You would go to, for example, Gemini has a deep research function, and you click that button, and then you take that output, and that becomes your literature review, and you use that to kind of automatically write a review of your paper. But there's another way where you could use that, where it becomes a starting point for you to kind of jump off and say, in this process, what are maybe the 3 or 4 most important articles to read? And then you go in and you deeply read that article. Another example would be when it comes to reading a paper, you could use AI to summarize what the paper says and not read the paper, or you could read the paper and then have a conversation with AI about the paper that helps you to read the paper more deeply. I find for, even my own personal use of AI, what I've found is I've actually ended up reading, literature more deeply because of this ability to have almost like a discussion group with AI. It's like having my own personal reading group with this, and it's helped me engage articles in a way that's much deeper than it was before. But the point being, there's different ways that we can use these tools. Some ways, might I think are worthy of being fearful of. If people start kind of put their brain on overdrive and don't automatic and don't really think about it. But I think there's lots of ways where these tools can be used to really deepen and enhance our abilities to think deeply about phenomena as scholars.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
I really appreciate, Vern, how you do point out that there are different ways to use these technologies. So we don't do well to simply talk about them all the same way. I mean, clearly, ChatGPT 4 is different from version 3 and so forth. There's nuances between different large language models as examples. And there's clearly different ways for us to use them and for them to use us as well. I think what I wonder, even just from hearing you speak, what does it mean to read an article, to read a paper, to use the language of reading as AI, to say that you're having an AI read a paper for you? Can AI get into a paper in the same way you or I can get into a book, to have a subjective experience of it? If we reduce reading to summarizing or pulling out points or patterns of, language tokens into an abstract, is that really getting at or grasping or coming to terms with what an author is saying? So I think one thing I've learned from, reading a lot of the methodological literature on AI is as a starting place, we also need to be very careful of the kind of words that we use to describe how we relate to AI. So I would challenge you, Vern, and I don't have an answer for this. Is reading the right word to use when we talk about AI engaging with a text compared to processing?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think that the way that I described it is, I think and the way I kind of personally tend to use it is I read and then I use AI to be a conversation partner. So I think I am reading it. Your question, which I think is interesting, is if I don't read an article and I just use an AI summary, is that reading? And I think you're right to point out that probably is not reading. It's a different sort of engagement with the content. And which I think is useful. An example would be as a scholar, I don't know, if I'm reviewing a paper and there's maybe a paper that wasn't familiar with that an author engages, in the past, you don't have time to read 15 papers, every time you do a review. I've found AI summaries to help, increase the quality of my review process. But would I call that reading? I think you're right, Michael, to flag that. I think it's a different activity.
Yes, please, Ali.
Okay, thanks. This is very interesting conversation. Yeah, redefining really what reading and comprehension is, and in relation to AI, particularly, I want to emphasize the kind of the reasoning power of some of these models that are constantly improving. And one simple example is if you think about, like advanced prompting techniques like tree of thoughts or chain of thoughts as two examples of advanced prompting, how you actually delve deeper into the sort of the text by providing kind of multiple trails and paths for thinking, but also interpretations of what you initially actually put as an interviewing script. And how would that help you or kind of, I guess, remind you of the different aspects of meaning in the text. For example, we know from research that ChatGPT is probably ChatGPT 5 now is much better, would be more good at inductive analysis when it comes to qualitative data than Claude from Anthropic is. Deductive, so not inductive, deductive. If you have a code book, it's probably easier and more accurate for you to do that kind of analysis, whereas Claude, with its analytical power, really delves deeper into some kind of cultural and contextual aspects of text and what that helps you in terms of research process, but also reading the different interpretations. So imagine that if you are researching parental grief and you are a parent, how do you prompt a model like Claude to pose some 10 skeptical questions, probing questions to you to question your preconceptions and preconceived assumptions around. So this is actually possible in a way, and that's how fast these models are developing, and reasoning becomes one of the key benchmarking techniques that they do. I'm not suggesting these are perfect, but they are actually getting better at trying to provide different interpretations and different thematic analysis of text for you to explore and probe. And this is all thinking from the perspective of these tools augment, not replace or remove the need for human oversight, human intervention, or deeper analysis. Particularly when it comes to qualitative research methods such as phenomenology, where lived experience is foundation, and these models don't have that lived experience or consciousness, which some people argue that they don't think, even though reasoning they do at PhD level reasoning and math problems, but not necessarily the case. It's very different when it comes to deconstructing text and trying to reveal interpretations and contextual cues.
Go ahead, Michael.
I mean, I think you're right. Many of these different technologies have come a long way. It's one of the reasons it's hard to make sense of the literature, because when you look at the studies that have been done, for example, comparing, human reasoning, and I'll admit I'll have the same problem by talking about artificial intelligence reasoning as I probably have to reading. Regardless, when you look at that work, it seems to be a recurring theme that although AI can perform these tasks, they still are lacking when it comes to interpretive nuance, when it comes to context, when it comes to depth, when it comes to latent meaning, thematic aspects. And part of it also reflects, not just the technology, but also the user of how they engage with them. What do I mean by that? Much of the qualitative work that I've seen published, which openly discloses the use of AI to inform aspects such as the analysis, tends to be more content analysis, conceptual analysis in kind or of sort. And unfortunately, quite a bit of this kind of work to begin with, does at times suffer from more, superficial, surface level reading, right? So, can, modern large language models perform these tasks? They can. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean that they grasp the meaning that they generate text about. So like you said, Ali, it requires that, we're not working in isolation from them, right? So using that common phrase, a human in the loop, which I know a number of AI qualitative researchers have turned towards. But here's where I struggle. In the same token that researchers talk about the importance of a human in the loop, they use phrases like AI as a reflexive collaborator, an active partner, a supportive friend, an additional member of the analysis team. And yet, I don't know to what extent AI necessarily brings depth, nuance, and interpretation to the work compared to if they had engaged with, the sources themselves, or potential other researchers.
Go ahead.
I think I think in many ways, Michael, you're hitting at the crux of the issue, and it becomes how do we conceptualize the agency of AI in the research process? And for me, the key way to, like if I look at your concerns, I think there's a way where, let's say you have a series of 50 interviews and you want to have AI go about doing coding. And so you basically say, AI code the interviews. Um, I think that can produce very shallow work. The way that I've personally used AI, the way that I think it's used effectively, you have to understand, and I think this goes to some of what Ollie talked about earlier with different forms of prompting technique. The way that you prompt the AI to do the coding, if you're a skilled qualitative researcher, I think creates fundamentally different results. And so for me, there is in one of the papers that I've written on the topic, we talk about how prompting is a new form of expertise. And I think that essentially with good prompting, with deep prompting, where you're setting the context that the LLM is using to analyze the data, you can come up with very effective, codes. My perspective on this is when I've used this is these codes are not AI generated codes. They're human generated codes that are coming out of my prompting. I'm not setting the AI off to do it, completely independent, but there's been so much work that I've done as a qualitative researcher with kind of deep expertise that it ends up being my work through that process. It's very iterative. It's very engaged. But I think that you have to recognize that, and as a human researcher, my perspective of the ethics of this is I have to take 100% full and complete accountability for the AI analysis because it's really my analysis and the AI is a tool, so to speak.
Go ahead, Michael.
Gosh, Vern, there's so much that you said that I want to respond to. I should have been taking notes. So one question that I would ask does relate to the ethics of the so-called qualitative researcher. So I do wonder in what way, as you describe, becoming an expert in prompting, we begin to transition from, researchers who are engaging directly with human phenomena. Yes, interview text is one way of starting to explore human phenomena, but we're not text analyzers. At least that's not how I would characterize myself as a qualitative researcher. The data is not the text, right? The text is something that helps to show aspects of the meaning of an experience. But are we moving methodologically towards becoming something like statisticians, where we become experts in, operating programs to essentially analyze text to generate some kind of output? Maybe that's not a bad thing, but it does speak to the so-called ethics of qualitative inquiry if this is how we're moving, whether some of us or all of us or the field as a whole. The last thing I wanted to respond to, well, not the last, but from what you said, was taking accountability. And I think one of the things that for me is very challenging about AI, particularly large language models, is they are working with human language. So the intelligence of artificial intelligence is derived from the source texts, right? So to say that, as an author who uses AI, I'm accountable for the work, I think that's probably correct to say, but I don't know if I would say that it represents wholly my work when AI is essentially drawing upon textual sources to create some kind of text output that resembles something else, right? And I think we can see examples of that just from experimenting with AI, meaning it's easy for us to, put in a research article written by ourselves or others and having AI generate something that looks like it, yet also incorporating some qualitative material. And then I would ask the question, at what point is your work truly your work compared to something else? And I know we use words like plagiarism, but there's something different here, something different from plagiarism at play, which involves mimicry or copying or some kind of emulation. And I think this is a conversation that is very much still being had or should be had in our community. So I'm glad that we can bring it up here.
Thanks, Michael. So yeah, you brought the discussion of ethical considerations, which are really foundational. I would add, within the context of ethical, a number of different facets. There is transparency, as you said, and that transparency really extends to from citations, what kind of sources you are using, how reliable and credible those sources are, to the data that you have fed into any of these platforms and the outputs that you got. And so the challenge we are experiencing is transparency around what sources of data these platforms have used. And to be honest, of all these platforms that are now available, I think Perplexity AI was the only one that actually very clearly laid out citations very early on back in 2023. This is a list of citations that I'm using. No other platform, Gemini, Claude, Copilot, Mistral AI, Grok, none of them actually provided citations. So that lack of transparency and also lack of transparency around underlying data they have used for training purposes, which is even more problematic because you wouldn't know. And in a way, kind of perpetuating all the biases that already exist and inherent in kind of the environment of the web and Google Books with 40 million digitized content to other sources. So I think lack of transparency around that, but also in the research process, that's why in our like the guidelines that we have been working on is how do you ensure transparency from the perspective of a researcher that if you are using these platforms, what you're using, for what purposes, how you use that, and the emphasis on the process rather than the product, that this becomes very important in even assessment redesign, that a student or graduate student or postdoc scholar understands that the implications around transparency around what sources of data and citations and academic work you are drawing upon to come to this conclusion. And absolutely, you're right. What portion and parts of that is your voice and your thinking and your writing? I think that's one, but also other ethical issues around. And today is an important day. Misrepresentation of indigenous knowledges, cultures, heritage, languages, right? That again, similar inaccuracies, biased and discriminatory treatment of indigenous knowledge in books and articles and social media. Uh, they are all used in these platforms. So I think that's another way. I would add the term explainability, which is a term that is often used actually in the design of large language models, but it's applicable here because a researcher has to be able to explain what sources of data they have used and what portions and parts are their work and their thinking and tools that because these tools, as I said, they can literally be used for from data collection to data analysis to methodology. Someone was actually kind of making a kind of a critical comment about, well, this generation of researchers, so they are going to be writing AI articles. All the article is generated by AI, and a peer reviewer on the other side of the scope would use an AI platform to review that and get a publication out of it, which it speaks about I think, lack of transparency, lack of ethical considerations in terms of explainability, but also transparency in the form of uh, what tools you have used and what sources of data you have used. And explainability actually also expands to reproducibility of research that you mentioned that you have read some qualitative studies that are you able to actually replicate those, right? Is there enough process information or methodological rigor to actually kind of do that study again? So, which of course in different platforms. which one final point I make is the notion of plagiarism, which there's a book published by Trisha Gallant. Is called The Opposite of Cheating: Teaching for Academic Integrity in the Age of AI. Really talks about how we have to redefine academic integrity in relation to AI. How do we design assessments that actually test students' knowledge and understanding, not grammar or spelling or a kind of superficial essay writing exercise? So there's a host of ethical considerations around that. And how do we capture that in terms of guidelines and guardrails, but also support that kind of innovation that people need to know about these tools? I mean, these tools are mushrooming. How do we actually take an ethical approach and responsibility to use these tools?
If I could
Vern,
just,
do you want to go, and then Michael, you can get in there.
yeah, I really like all of your points about transparency in the process, and that it's really important to know that. And I wanted to kind of use that as a springboard to address one of the other concerns that Michael expressed that I think is also really important, which is this is textual data. These are textual tools. So, and I think that the language that I've used in writing about this is, we have to recognize that generative AI can only analyze machine readable data. And there's lots of data that is not machine readable. And really, as qualitative researchers, a lot of the data that we're analyzing is not machine readable. So, we have, embodied kind of, interactions that we're analyzing. Earlier mentioned like indigenous knowledge and other forms of knowledge systems that are not basically in the training data of the AI systems. This is really important. And I think part of the ethical use of AI is anyone who's using AI has a responsibility to actually have a very deep understanding of the technologies that they're using. Um, the way that I think of it is, for me, the essence of qualitative researcher is basically abduction, right? You have a certain belief, and what we're doing through the research process is we're trying to generate surprises, which can help us, then develop new theories of different phenomena. And the primary way that I'm using generative AI is basically as a mechanism of producing surprises. And what are the different types of surprises I can have from generative AI, maybe analyzing my data in a different manner. But fundamentally, I think I'm always recognizing there are things that generative AI can't do because of the inherent nature of its pattern recognition technology in that process. So if I'm coding and generative AI can help me see things, I might code something, in a human way. Can generative AI help me see things in a different way? It sometimes can do that. It's very useful in that process. But again, that's creating a surprise pathway. I'm understanding kind of how is it that generative AI can be used to help me see things in a different way to produce surprises more rapidly. That's kind of, for me, one of the core ethical ways that I think of using AI is recognizing this is a tool or a technique that's helping me think about my data in different ways, which is what I'm trying to do to be able to generate new theory.
Go ahead, Michael.
Vern, I very much agree with your sentiment about the requirement for AI literacy knowledge, a deep understanding of AI for researchers who are engaging with it. Recognizing that we're still learning about AI as well. I also very much appreciate both you and Ali how you've brought up a number of these kind of principles that are now being articulated to look at the ethics of AI, like transparency, explainability, fairness, sustainability, and so forth. But I also appreciate that you both alluded to the ethics of AI goes deeper than these principles, at least a surface understanding of them. So if we're talking about AI, we have to think all the way back to the data in which it was trained upon and what knowledge it privileges and what knowledge it appropriates, right? If an AI is being trained, on large volumes of English text and passing over that knowledge, which is oral, that is pictorial, that is in other languages. What is that going to say about the output as far as the research that we're going to generate from using AI, right? And my sense is from people who've published on this is that AI does have a tendency towards output homogenation. I'm probably saying that word wrong with my cold, right? But essentially that amounts to, generic insights, trivial findings. And is that what we're really looking for when it comes to qualitative research, right? For our so-called interpretations to be informed by the majority of texts, the average text that was essentially used to train an AI. And that's something I guess I'm struggling a little bit about. It's also interesting to see in many of these papers that has been alluded to, people returning to words like repeatability, right? Can I repeat something? Many qualitative traditions have moved beyond that, right? I mean, there is no one interpretation that is like the golden interpretation. So why is it that we're now returning to those kind of positivistic ways of thinking about qualitative inquiry, where something has to be, repeatable or replicable? Maybe
If
that's
I
the method of AI.
I can just comment really quickly. I think I agree with you 100% that the repeatability is not necessarily the way that we would use it. And I would just highlight that in the way that I think about AI, Michael, the you're right about the underlying data not necessarily, you know, being what it is, but through prompting, you can basically create very focused analyses of AI. So although there's massive amounts of training data, if I'm focusing it on like one particular paper or one particular data set, it can, my experience is it can go beyond producing the shallow generic insights. So I think it is a concern that you're saying. I think that good use of AI can overcome that concern, but I think that it's really, really critical that we're able to do that. One of my biggest concerns about AI that is maybe related is how do you train like is someone who's an expert, and I say use that term lightly in the sense of just having a PhD, having been through the academic process for 15 years. I know how to evaluate AI tools. I know how to do these things. How does this work for new people who maybe haven't had the same, depth of experience to be able to interact, with a deeper manner? And I think that this idea of training novices is really important to understand. There's a scholar named Matt Bean who has a very accessible but academically deep book called The Skill Code, where he talks about this whole challenge of, kind of training novices. And I think, for me, this is one of the biggest, issues of ethics and in concern for the profession is how do we train the new generation with these tools so they don't end up producing the shallow work that we're all concerned with, I think.
I wonder if this might be a good time to open ourselves up to some good questions that are in the Q&A. I just want to take the privilege of being the moderator to also say I've been thinking a lot as you've all been talking. And, I think what you just said, Vern, has been a sort of, sort of growing observation as I've been listening to you talk about, what does it actually mean? You all are talking about yourselves as being very conscious and thoughtful and reflective as you're using Gen AI and questioning and problematizing it. I think a great ethical worry is actually the student or early career researcher, or honestly experienced researcher who's starting to use LLMs and do tend to take the first or second iteration, maybe don't see it as a tool to collaborate with or talk to or have a conversation with. And as in my work thinking about AI ethics, I'm less likely to use it as someone who's mostly interested in phenomenology as a method. I'm probably not going to use it as a method, but I do think it has particular advantages to study how AI changes and LLMs, I'll be specific, changes and shapes data. And that brings me back around to what we've talked a lot about in terms of being transparent. I wonder if it's possible to be transparent. It's one thing to say I collaborated with, or an AI, an LLM was part of the research team, but like as far as saying what actually happened. And I think transparency is often given as a way to be ethical, as a way to respond to ethical worries. But we've all flipped past 5 pages of the contract when you're saying, do you agree or disagree? You have to agree to move forward. That's an effort at transparency, but like who actually reads all of those words? And I have the same worry about actually, sort of claiming transparency without actually being transparency. And again, my privilege as moderator is that we're going to take this all forward into questions from the people who are here with us. But maybe this can come up a response in these questions. This is a big one from, I'm so sorry, I'm probably not going to pronounce your name wrong, right, Conciseo. Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is, what are the key ethical considerations and potential risks when using AI tools for data analysis and qualitative research? I mean, we've attended to this in some ways already, I think in fairly deep ways. But are there, again, thinking about a beginning researcher or someone who's just beginning to use these tools, what are key ethical considerations?
May I start?
Yeah, go ahead, Ellie. You can have this question.
Well, yes, we have experienced the world of the web for over 32 years. We haven't been able to solve the two key issues, privacy and bias. And now, and I say that with full confidence because there is research in that, when it comes to search engines and what is available on the web. And now with this generation of large language models, of course, those two would be really foundational and key in terms of also understanding the world around us, because we do know that from many surveys around the world, excuse me, of students, of scholars and researchers, several of them, that people are using these platforms. And ethical issues around privacy in particular and data protection. A lot of people, and when it comes to qualitative data in particular, we often mention that in other types of research, but de-identification and anonymization of data that can actually, these large language models can actually do for you. But how reliable is that? So you could basically provide a set of data to anonymize it for you. Issues around privacy, but also issues around how these models capture your data in a variety of ways, from very, very prominent like DeepSeek out of China to OpenAI, and with very similar in a way, very small, tiny prints of disclaimers that we remember years ago we had in search engines. Now it is and whether you use a paid version or a free version or a temporary version of these platforms, there are different implications around data privacy and what kinds of data basically get captured for training purposes, for improving. And this is, again, the idea is not new. Search engines have been, like Google, have been capturing users' prior interaction data to inform recommendations and things like that. Amazon does that. So I think privacy is huge, but also biases, and biases could be cultural biases, gender biases, indigenous biases, and even the counter argument is that you could use these platforms actually to detect your own subconscious or unconscious biases. You could basically upload your writing and say, identify some of the places where I have not been gender aware, or I have had biases, my own individual. So how do you actually develop or promote the kind of a nuanced understanding of these ethical issues And again, going back to what Vern said about like the novices or people who are new to this, a lot of students are using, but they don't really know the depth of these challenges and ethical concerns. They just use that and I said, can I use this platform or that platform without actually knowing about privacy or biases. I would say those are the two. I think there was a report out of the US that really said that these models are trying to rapidly compete and publish their models without proper benchmarking. And which gets into the territory of AI governance, right? That do we have a place? I mean, Europe has been much better in terms of regulatory frameworks, and in Canada too. US is very broad, and there is no one single regulatory framework. There are multiple organizations completing this, but kind of as a country, it's not similar to Europe. So anyway, to capture those ethical issues, I'll stop there.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
I agree with Ali. There's a number of, of publications now that have essentially articulated principles, transparency, explainability, fairness, sustainability, privacy, security, veracity, accountability, trust. The list goes on and on. So papers by Doshi and Jobin as first authors. But then there's also papers that point to the considerations as being context specific, right? So there may be specific considerations for use of AI in pedagogical spaces. I believe that Dr. Lemmermeyer authored such a paper. But I would also say that when we talk about ethics and AI or large language models or other technologies, it's not enough to look at ethics from a considerations perspective. We have to ask the question of how do things change? How do things change between how I, as a researcher, now relate to the words of others? How do things change as it relates to the experiences of others? So we don't want to just look at ethics in a so-called principled or conceptual way. We also have to understand ethics as relating to otherness, if that makes sense.
Is it okay if we move on to another question? We aren't going to get to all the questions. I apologize, but I'll do my best here. This is one that weighs on me. How much should we take, or the question is, how much do you take into account the unethical behind the scenes practices that even make LLM possible? So environmental threat, stolen IP to train, poorly paid and harmful practices, data workers. I think this refers to like the data cleaners. Should we be considering any of this before adopting the tools, or has that ship sailed? Trena Paulus asks us.
I don't think we can ignore that. I think we have to attend to that, and we have a responsibility continually to give voice to that as well.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, me too. This obviously is an area that we all, really need to give thought to, and it also might go back to governance, as Ali said. Catherine Dube asks, not everyone can become an expert on the inner workings of every AI they might use. How can this function be addressed on a higher level to provide assessments to guide their use? I'm thinking of Cochrane collaborative methods, for example, as a similar metaphor, but this takes time. So this is, I think, referring to what you said, Vern, about a responsibility to know about, how the LLM that we're using works. I sympathize with Catherine. Not everyone can become an expert, but at the same time, I agree that this is an obligation. So I think Catherine is asking, is there a way in between to help people? Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
I think the first response to this question is that we need to acknowledge that it requires expertise, right?
Yeah.
So in the same way we give respect to traditions like narrative inquiry, grounded theory, and so forth as requiring expertise, we should also give respect to engaging with AI and research also requires expertise and therefore requires investment. If I had a graduate student who was really getting into using AI to shape methodology, I'd look to form collaboratives with someone who has that expertise, potentially someone from computer sciences, right? But I also think that we need to balance that expertise also through readings in philosophy of language, for example, right? Because just because someone is an expert in, generating or creating prompts, that doesn't mean that they necessarily understand what they're doing with the language itself, right? And at least for large language models, as an example of one kind of AI, a lot of its intelligence is in language itself. So I would hope that graduate students who are using large language models would also take time to absorb, read, engage with some of the scholars who've actually written on philosophy of language.
I think Vern's hand was up first. Go ahead, Vern.
I think it's a great question. I think, although I appreciate what Michael said, I do think that you can get enough expertise to be able to use the tools without necessarily doing massive deep dives. For me, even spending, if you think in terms of if you're going to use large language models, spending a day to just um, hear people describe how the AI technology works in, simple kind of plain language ways. There's lots of explanations of these tools this way. I think that it is really helpful. And then I think the other way that you generate expertise, the way that I think about it, is you use it. And, I think Ethan Mollick is a business school professor at Wharton who's written a lot about the use of AI, and he talks about bring AI to the table. And, one of the ways that you develop an expertise with this is you just see how it answers questions, knowing what the answer is. And so for me, the building the expertise, a lot of it comes from just using it over and over and over again. And then you get a feel for, again, Ethan Mollick has this term, the jagged frontier. What can AI do? What can't it do? I think a lot of this we learn it from practice, and we learn how does what it can and can't do. Really, you learn it from using it and from using these different models. Ali talked earlier about Claude is better for inductive approaches and ChatGPT is better for deductive approaches. This type of assessment only comes from using these tools and seeing how they work in different contexts. So for me, the practice actually helps you build your expertise.
Go ahead, Ali.
Just one quick comment, and I agree with all of that. I think the importance of again AI literacy, and also the technical support is needed. But even you can also run language models locally on your laptop. If there are some tools like Anything LM and Olama that you could actually basically access these without actually your data being captured by these platforms. So you can run these models locally on your machine. There's a sort of basic technical support is needed, but institutions should really venture into this area now that these platforms exist. You could use these platforms safely and securely without your data to test also. And comparative actually use of these platforms, as Vern said, comparative use of these platforms is also very much recommended and important because that's how you get a more critical perspective of the sort of strengths and weaknesses of these platforms when it comes to a certain task or a certain kind of research or data analysis. So that's another way of actually doing it, but we need probably more technical support from your institution, your department.
I have been given permission to push at the boundary of the time a little bit. I wonder if we might have one more question and then we'll finish. This question is something I'm interested in too, and I'm drawing together a couple of the questions in the Q&A about one's asking, is it safe to input the data? So, we might think of transcripts or observation notes or whatever into the AI, into the LLM model, I'm assuming LLM. And just sort of in combination, another one asks, this idea about asking research participants if we have their consent to use their, again, their data in LLMs or in, like putting them into LLMs. So how are we as researchers engaging in this foundational question? Jane Cullingworth answers, and also that's from sort of combined with Christine Filguera's question. Is it ethical to consider giving over data to LLMs, even with participant consent? I realize this is a deep question, but if we could spend a few minutes here and then we'll say goodbye.
I'll just make a quick comment on this. I think it's very important to, if you're doing research on this, to understand what the rules are of that particular LLMs you're using. I think that many of them basically have a default setting where they are using your data to train their model. And if you don't turn that off, then I think you're violating all of these particular types of issues. I think that being said, I think it's not difficult to get to have, with the large language models to basically create a practice where it's as secure as using a typical cloud server in that process. But you have to make sure that anyone who's using these tools needs to make sure that they understand this, because it's very important.
Thanks, Vern. Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
I'd echo Vern. Particularly also, as you were alluding to, Jillian, when it comes to a process of informed consent, we need to be having these conversations so people who are participating in research appreciate just how their data is so-called being used, their words. It struck me in your initial question, you asked about safety, and my gut reaction is we should also ask the question of, is this safe for the researcher? Because there is some research now questioning or asking, how does the use of AI affect critical thinking, literacy, and so forth? So if we're supporting graduate students, we also have ethical responsibilities to them as well. And if we're essentially supporting them to train to use AI to approach qualitative material, you could ask the question of, are we thinking about their safety when it comes to their ability to think critically? But again,
Yeah.
I recognize that very much depends on how AI is used, and we have to be very careful that we don't level a technology in broad strokes. But we do need to be thoughtful about how these technologies are changing the way we relate to language, experience, and meaning.
Thanks, Michael.
And if I just add, as I noted
Yeah,
earlier, if you want it to be really kind of safe and secure and private, rather than using the public accessible or paid versions, running a kind of some of these models locally would be safe. So the basically data rests on your laptop. It doesn't go anywhere. But of course, recognizing what Vern and Michael said in terms of it's a new type of consent that you have to seek. That are you okay for me to use your data and use an AI assistant to analyze it or coding it or for other purposes? But I think that understanding of privacy concerns or data privacy or data use agreements, that's foundational to understand, and it's not easy to understand. So you need to, I mean, that's part of AI literacy too.
Well, on that sobering note, a reminder of our responsibility. I want to thank you all, my wonderful panelists, for this really, I think, lively scholarly discussion. That's actually rare, I think, to find often these days. And I've enjoyed this last hour very much. I want to thank our collaborators at the WCQR, and of course, all of you, thank you, participants, for sharing this last tiny bit more than an hour with us. And I think the WCQR has a few final remarks to make, so I pass it to you, Sonia.